For most of human history, empires did not collapse because of sudden invasions or dramatic battles. They collapsed slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. This story is about one of those collapses. It did not begin with war. It did not begin with rebellion. It began with trade, with ships crossing oceans, with merchants counting profits, and with a substance so small, so ordinary-looking, that no one believed it could weaken a civilization that had stood for centuries. In the early 18th century, China was not a weak nation. It was one of the most advanced and self-sufficient empires on Earth. Its population was massive. Its agriculture was efficient. Its bureaucracy was disciplined. Its culture was deeply rooted in tradition and order. From the Chinese perspective, the world did not revolve around Europe. Europe was distant, insignificant. A group of foreign traders knocking at the gates of a civilization that already had everything it needed. The Qing dynasty controlled China with confidence. Foreign trade was allowed, but only under strict rules. Western merchants were restricted to specific ports. They were not allowed to travel freely. They were not allowed to influence Chinese society. China exported tea, silk, porcelain. The West paid in silver. And slowly, the silver began to drain out of Europe. This imbalance troubled Britain deeply. By the late 1700s, tea had become a daily necessity in British life. But Britain had very little that China wanted in return. Silver reserves were shrinking. The British economy felt the pressure. So Britain searched for a solution? They found it in India. In British-controlled India, vast fields of poppy plants were cultivated. From these poppies came opium. At first, opium was just another commodity. But when British merchants introduced it into China, everything changed. Opium was illegal in China. Chinese law strictly forbade its use and trade. Officials warned of its dangers. Doctors described its effects. Addiction spread quietly, household by household. Still, foreign traders continued. Smuggling became routine. Corruption grew. Officials were bribed. Ports became gateways not just for goods, but for dependency. By the early 19th century, millions of Chinese citizens were addicted to opium. Workers became less productive. Soldiers became weaker. Families collapsed under the weight of addiction. Silver, once flowing into China, now flowed out again, this time in exchange for opium. The Qing government noticed the damage. But response came too late. In 1839, a Chinese official named Lin Zexu took action. He confiscated and destroyed massive quantities of opium at the port of Canton. To China, this was law enforcement. To Britain, it was an attack on trade. Diplomacy failed. Tension escalated. Then came war. The Opium War was not a fair conflict. China fought with outdated weapons. Britain arrived with modern naval power, artillery, and industrial logistics. The result was inevitable. China lost. What followed was not just defeat, but humiliation. The Treaty of Nanking forced China to open ports. Foreigners gained legal immunity. Hong Kong was ceded. Tariffs were controlled by foreign powers. China remained independent in name, but not in reality. This marked the beginning of what Chinese historians would later call the century of humiliation. More wars followed. More treaties. More concessions. Each one weakened the Qing state further. Internally, rebellion erupted. The Taiping Rebellion alone killed tens of millions. The government struggled to maintain order. Traditional systems failed to adapt to a changing world. By the late 19th century, China was no longer a confident empire. It was a fragmented society under constant pressure. Foreign influence shaped its economy. Missionaries challenged its traditions. Railways and factories arrived, but under foreign control. In 1912, the Qing dynasty collapsed entirely. An empire that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries came to an end. There was no single moment of destruction. No final battle that decided everything. Just slow erosion. Trade imbalance. Addiction. Corruption. Military inferiority. Political paralysis. History often remembers wars and revolutions. But the true turning points are quieter. A ship unloading crates at a port. A merchant calculating profit. A government delaying reform. Empires do not always fall because they are attacked. Sometimes, they fall because they believe they are too strong to fall at all. And by the time they realize the truth, the damage is already irreversible. History is often explained through wars, revolutions, and famous leaders. But most of the time, history does not move loudly. It moves slowly, through systems, habits, paperwork, and decisions that seem reasonable at the time. This story is not about a sudden collapse. There is no single dramatic moment. No clear villain. No heroic rescue. It is the story of how a powerful system weakened itself, not because it was defeated, but because it failed to notice how the world around it was changing. In the late 18th century, China was one of the largest and most stable empires on Earth. Its population was enormous. Its economy was productive. Its government had ruled through bureaucracy rather than constant warfare. To the Qing dynasty, stability was proof of superiority. The empire believed that order, tradition, and continuity were signs of success. Change was considered dangerous. Foreign ideas were unnecessary. China did not see itself as part of a global competition. It saw itself as the center of civilization. Across the ocean, however, a different system was developing. European powers were expanding outward. Their economies depended on trade, extraction, and growth. They were not self-sufficient. They needed access. By the early 1700s, Britain had become deeply dependent on Chinese goods. Tea was no longer a luxury. It was part of daily life. Porcelain, silk, and other exports flowed steadily into Europe. China, however, wanted very little in return. Silver became the only acceptable payment. And year after year, silver flowed out of Britain and into China. This imbalance created anxiety in London. Trade deficits were not an abstract concept. They affected currency stability, government budgets, and political confidence. British merchants and officials searched for something, anything, that China would accept in large quantities. The answer did not come from Europe. It came from India. In British-controlled territories, opium production expanded quietly. At first, it was treated as a regional commodity. Then it became a financial solution. Opium was illegal in China. The law was clear, but enforcement was inconsistent, especially along the coast. British traders did not need Chinese approval. They relied on smugglers, intermediaries, and corruption. The trade grew gradually, not explosively. That was the danger. At first, opium affected individuals, then families, then entire communities. Officials noticed declining productivity. Soldiers became unreliable. Silver began flowing out of China instead of in. The Qing government responded cautiously. Too cautiously. Officials debated policy while the trade expanded. They feared disrupting stability more than confronting the problem directly. By the time decisive action was taken, the system was already compromised. When Chinese authorities finally moved to suppress the opium trade, Britain interpreted it as a threat to economic freedom rather than law enforcement. The resulting conflict was not just a war. It was a collision between two worldviews. China believed sovereignty meant control. Britain believed commerce justified force. The war exposed technological and organizational weaknesses within the Qing military. It also exposed the dangers of isolation. China lost quickly. The treaties that followed did not dismantle the empire overnight. They simply removed its ability to control its own future. Ports were opened. Legal authority was diluted. Foreign influence became permanent. Internally, pressure increased. The bureaucracy struggled to respond. Traditional systems could not adapt fast enough. Rebellions emerged. Not because people rejected the empire, but because the empire could no longer manage them. Economic stress, population growth, and administrative paralysis created a cycle that fed on itself. By the late 19th century, China still existed, but it no longer directed events. Decisions were reactive. Reforms were incomplete. Authority was fragmented. The collapse, when it came, felt almost administrative. No dramatic ending. Just the quiet replacement of an old system with something undefined. History later called this decline inevitable. But inevitability is often a label applied after failure, not before. The Qing dynasty did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it mistook stability for permanence. This is how many systems end. Not with chaos, but with delayed adaptation. Not with defeat, but with denial. And by the time the need for change becomes undeniable, the ability to change has already disappeared. History rarely announces itself. It does not warn societies when decline has begun. Most of the time, decline looks like normal life continuing as usual. In the late 18th century, life in China appeared stable. Farmers worked the land. Markets functioned. Officials filed reports. Taxes were collected. Rituals were observed. From the outside, the Qing Empire seemed unchanged. This appearance of continuity was deeply reassuring to those in power. Stability was interpreted as success. Longevity was interpreted as proof of correctness. The system had worked before, so it was assumed it would continue to work. The Qing state governed through an enormous bureaucracy. Examinations selected officials based on classical knowledge. Administration prioritized order, hierarchy, and precedent. Innovation was not forbidden, but it was discouraged. Change was slow by design. This approach had advantages. It reduced chaos. It limited sudden disruption. It preserved tradition. But it also created blind spots. While the Qing state focused inward, the world beyond its borders was reorganizing itself. European economies were becoming industrialized. Production increased. Consumption expanded. Trade networks intensified. Britain, in particular, depended on global trade to sustain its growth. Unlike China, Britain could not afford self-sufficiency. This difference mattered. China viewed trade as optional. Britain viewed trade as essential. When British merchants encountered Chinese restrictions, they did not interpret them as cultural boundaries. They interpreted them as obstacles. The Canton system limited foreign contact. Trade was confined. Movement was restricted. Communication was controlled. From the Chinese perspective, this system maintained order. From the British perspective, it was inefficient. As British demand for Chinese goods grew, so did pressure on British finances. Silver shortages became a political concern. Trade imbalance turned into a strategic problem. The solution was not debated publicly. It developed quietly, through commercial practice. Opium offered a reversal of silver flow. It was compact. It was addictive. It created repeat demand. Once introduced, it required no persuasion. The opium trade expanded gradually. There was no sudden flood. There was no immediate collapse. This gradualism delayed alarm. Local officials noticed problems, but reporting them upward risked career consequences. Acknowledging failure was dangerous in a system that rewarded stability. As addiction spread, the impact was diffuse. It did not cripple a single industry. It weakened many small ones. Productivity declined in subtle ways. Absenteeism increased. Military discipline softened. None of these changes were dramatic enough to trigger immediate reform. Meanwhile, the silver drain reversed. China began losing currency. Prices fluctuated. Economic confidence weakened. The Qing state attempted limited responses. Warnings were issued. Bans were repeated. But enforcement required confrontation, with smugglers, with corrupt officials, and eventually with foreign traders. Confrontation was avoided. The decision to act decisively came late, and when it did, it collided with British assumptions about trade and power. The Opium War exposed a reality the Qing state had avoided acknowledging. Military modernization had lagged. Naval power was insufficient. Logistics were outdated. The defeat itself was not catastrophic. What followed was more damaging. The treaties that ended the war institutionalized foreign presence. They normalized unequal treatment. They constrained future policy choices. Ports became semi-autonomous zones. Legal authority fragmented. The Qing state did not collapse. It continued functioning. But it functioned under new limitations. From this point forward, governance became reactive. Each new challenge required negotiation with external powers. Each reform risked internal resistance. Population growth increased pressure on land and resources. Urbanization strained infrastructure. Corruption expanded as officials sought personal security in an uncertain system. Rebellions were symptoms, not causes. The Taiping Rebellion revealed the depth of social strain. Millions died. The state survived, but at enormous cost. Survival required compromises. Local power holders gained autonomy. Central authority weakened. Foreign powers exploited this fragmentation. Influence expanded through loans, railways, and trade concessions. Modernization arrived unevenly. Technology was imported without institutional reform. Factories existed alongside obsolete administration. By the early 20th century, the Qing system remained intact in form but hollow in function. Decision-making was slow. Authority was contested. Legitimacy was eroding. When the dynasty finally ended, it did not fall dramatically. It was replaced. The system had exhausted itself. History later framed this process as decline. But to those living through it, it felt like endurance. This is the danger of gradual failure. It disguises itself as continuity. Empires do not always fall because they are attacked. Sometimes they fall because they wait too long to change. As the 19th century progressed, the Qing state increasingly relied on improvisation rather than strategy. Policies were designed to manage crises, not prevent them. Each solution solved an immediate problem while creating a longer-term weakness. The bureaucracy remained extensive, but its effectiveness declined. Officials were trained in classical texts, not economics, engineering, or international diplomacy. Their authority depended on precedent, yet the challenges they faced had no precedent. Foreign trade continued to expand. But under foreign terms, customs revenue was increasingly controlled or supervised by outsiders. This reduced fiscal independence while increasing dependence on external loans. Debt became normalized. Loans funded infrastructure that benefited trade, not governance. Railways connected ports to resource regions, not provinces to each other. Economic integration favored extraction over stability. Meanwhile, social trust eroded. Peasants experienced rising taxes without corresponding protection. Urban workers faced instability as traditional crafts declined. Merchants navigated uncertainty between local law and foreign privilege. The state attempted reform through selective modernization. Weapons were purchased. Factories were established. Schools were introduced. But reforms were compartmentalized. They did not alter the core administrative structure. Old decision-making processes remained intact. This created a mismatch between capability and control. Modern tools were managed by pre-modern institutions. Technology advanced faster than governance. Foreign powers understood this imbalance. Influence was exerted through advisors, concessions, and financial leverage rather than direct rule. Control was indirect, but effective. Internally, political factions disagreed on the path forward. Some advocated preservation of tradition. Others demanded radical reform. Most compromised without resolving the conflict. Time passed, crises accumulated. Each rebellion weakened confidence. Each concession reduced autonomy. Each delay narrowed options. The imperial court became increasingly symbolic. Decisions required consensus that could no longer be reached. Authority fragmented among regional leaders. By the early 20th century, the Qing dynasty still existed, but it no longer directed national momentum. Events happened to the state. Not because of it. When revolution finally came, it was less an overthrow than a transition. The dynasty lacked the strength to resist and the legitimacy to endure. The end was administrative. Declarations were issued. Titles were relinquished. An empire dissolved into governance problems that had already existed for decades. What followed was uncertainty rather than renewal. The old system was gone, but no stable replacement emerged immediately. The legacy of delayed reform persisted. History often asks why the Qing failed to modernize in time. The answer is not ignorance. It is structure. Systems designed for stability resist change even when change becomes necessary. The very mechanisms that preserve order can prevent adaptation. This pattern is not unique. It appears repeatedly in history, across cultures and eras. Long-lived systems confuse survival with success. They interpret continuity as validation. Warning signs are dismissed as temporary disturbances. By the time failure becomes undeniable, reform requires dismantling the system itself. And dismantling is always more difficult than adjustment. The Qing dynasty did not fall suddenly. It faded under the weight of its own design. This is the quiet lesson of boring history. Not all disasters announce themselves. Some unfold slowly. While life continues, paperwork is filed, and rituals are observed. And when the end finally arrives, it feels less like catastrophe and more like exhaustion. History often hides in plain sight. It moves quietly, with small shifts and subtle patterns that few notice until the consequences are obvious. Empires, like living organisms, often fail not because of an external blow but because of internal rigidity. They are slow to respond to new pressures, and by the time the warning signs are undeniable, adaptation becomes nearly impossible. In China, during the late 18th century, life continued much as it had for generations. Farmers tilled their fields using the same methods. Merchants conducted trade in the same markets. Scholars debated Confucian principles. Officials filed reports in their bureaucratic offices, calculating taxes and maintaining records. Ceremonial rituals were observed precisely, reinforcing the illusion that order had no cracks. The Qing dynasty had ruled for decades, extending a sophisticated system across a vast territory. It relied on tradition, hierarchy, and a stable bureaucracy to maintain authority. Longevity was equated with correctness. Continuity was treated as evidence that the empire's methods were superior. Innovation, while tolerated in limited scope, was rarely encouraged. The preservation of tradition outweighed the exploration of new ideas. Outside China, however, the world was changing rapidly. Europe was becoming industrialized. Trade networks spanned continents. Consumption was rising as production increased. Nations like Britain needed continuous access to resources and markets to sustain their growth. Unlike China, self-sufficiency was impossible. Dependence on global trade was a requirement. This divergence in worldview created the conditions for eventual conflict. China saw trade as optional and secondary. Britain saw trade as essential and unnegotiable. Yet, for decades, both sides coexisted without open confrontation. It was only a matter of time before the pressures intensified. By the early 1700s, Britain was importing massive quantities of Chinese goods, especially tea, silk, and porcelain. The balance of trade was in China's favor. Silver flowed steadily eastward, leaving Britain increasingly concerned about economic stability. The solution the British found was opium, a commodity produced in British-controlled India. It was compact, profitable, and addictive, creating recurring demand. Opium entered China gradually, smuggled along coasts and rivers, often under the protection of bribed officials. Its effects were subtle at first. A few addicts here, a few families weakened there. The cumulative impact, however, was profound. Local authorities reported declines in productivity, but bureaucratic structures slowed response. Official caution and fear of disrupting perceived stability delayed decisive action. Meanwhile, silver began to flow back to Britain to pay for opium, reversing the traditional trade advantage. Economic stress built up slowly, often unnoticed by those far from the affected regions. By the 1830s, the Qing government, led by officials like Lin Zexu, finally acted decisively. They confiscated and destroyed opium at Canton. What seemed like law enforcement to China appeared to Britain as an attack on trade. The clash of perspectives led to the First Opium War, exposing weaknesses in China's military and logistical systems. British forces, equipped with superior technology and industrialized supply chains, defeated the Qing navy and forced the empire into unfavorable treaties. The Treaty of Nanking and subsequent agreements established semi-permanent foreign influence in China. Ports were opened. Legal authority was diluted. Hong Kong was ceded. Foreign powers controlled tariffs and trade, fundamentally shifting economic power. Internally, the empire faced new challenges. Peasant uprisings grew in frequency and scale. The Taiping Rebellion alone claimed tens of millions of lives. The government struggled to maintain legitimacy while managing foreign pressure and internal dissent. Administrative reforms were attempted, but changes were partial and inconsistent. Old structures persisted alongside new technologies, creating friction and inefficiency. Over decades, the pattern repeated. Foreign powers expanded influence through loans, infrastructure projects, and diplomatic pressure. Economic modernization occurred, but it often served foreign interests rather than national cohesion. Factories and railways existed, but governance and bureaucracy failed to integrate them effectively. By the late 19th century, the Qing dynasty continued in name but no longer in substance. Authority was fragmented. Decision-making slowed. Social trust eroded. The empire was administratively alive but strategically paralyzed. When revolution arrived in the early 20th century, the dynasty had little ability to resist or adapt. Its collapse was administrative, quiet, almost invisible to those outside China. By the time the Republic was declared, the system had already failed decades earlier. This story exemplifies how empires can fade gradually, under the weight of their own structures. Stability, long viewed as strength, became a trap. Warning signs, when subtle, can be ignored for decades. Crisis accumulates slowly, almost imperceptibly, until options for adaptation vanish. History is rarely loud. It does not enter the world with a drumbeat. It does not announce itself with headlines. Most of the time, history moves quietly, almost imperceptibly. It spreads through decisions that appear routine, through habits that seem natural, through institutions that appear eternal. In late 18th century China, life was steady, predictable, and structured. Farmers rose with the sun to tend fields. Markets opened at dawn, filled with the smells of grains, tea, and dried fish. Merchants counted coins carefully, haggling over every ounce of silver. Officials sat in offices lined with scrolls, recording taxes and writing reports. Rituals, both religious and bureaucratic, were observed meticulously, reinforcing the sense of order. The Qing dynasty had ruled for generations, its authority resting on a vast, hierarchical bureaucracy. Longevity of rule was interpreted as correctness. Stability was celebrated as proof of wisdom. The assumption was that the methods which had worked for centuries would continue to work. Innovation, while not forbidden, was carefully constrained. Disruption was seen as dangerous. But the world outside China was changing. Europe was industrializing. Trade networks expanded across oceans. Consumption increased alongside production. Nations like Britain required access to global markets and raw materials. Self-sufficiency was impossible. Dependence on trade was a structural necessity. China's worldview, rooted in centuries of self-sufficiency and internal stability, could not accommodate this urgency. Trade was optional. Foreigners were tolerated, but their influence was restricted. The Canton system limited contact, defining when, where, and how foreigners could operate. The system maintained order but created friction with emerging global forces. By the early 1700s, Britain was importing massive amounts of Chinese goods, especially tea, silk, and porcelain. The trade imbalance created political anxiety in London. Silver flowed eastward, leaving Britain concerned about domestic economic stability. The solution appeared in India: opium, produced in British-controlled territories. Opium offered a commodity that could reverse the flow of silver, creating recurring demand and substantial profit. Opium trade entered China slowly, initially in small quantities. Smuggling was discreet, facilitated by bribed officials and coastal networks. Effects appeared minor at first: a few addicts, a few disrupted households. Over decades, the cumulative impact became profound. Productivity declined. Military readiness weakened. Silver continued flowing out in exchange for opium. Economic stress increased gradually. Local officials observed problems but delayed reporting upward. Fear of career consequences and disruption of perceived stability slowed action. Limited bans and regulations were attempted, but enforcement was inconsistent. By the time decisive action was taken, the trade was entrenched. In 1839, Lin Zexu, a high-ranking official, confiscated and destroyed large quantities of opium in Canton. To China, this was law enforcement. To Britain, it was an attack on trade. The resulting First Opium War revealed technological and organizational gaps. British forces, equipped with modern artillery and naval power, defeated the Qing Navy. Treaties followed, opening ports, ceding territory, and establishing foreign privileges. The empire remained, but its autonomy and control were diminished. Internally, social unrest grew. Population pressures, economic stress, and administrative inefficiency created fertile ground for rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion alone claimed tens of millions of lives. The state struggled to respond. Regional leaders gained autonomy, while central authority weakened. The bureaucracy attempted selective modernization. Arsenals, railways, and schools were introduced, but systemic reform lagged behind. Foreign influence expanded through loans, infrastructure projects, and diplomatic leverage. Factories and technology arrived, but often served foreign interests. Governance and administrative structures remained pre-modern. This mismatch compounded vulnerabilities. Over decades, the Qing state persisted in name, but authority was fragmented. Decision-making slowed, and social trust eroded. When revolution eventually arrived in the early 20th century, the dynasty had little capacity to resist. Its fall was administrative, quiet, almost invisible, replacing one system with another without dramatic upheaval. The empire had exhausted itself. This is the pattern of slow historical decline: imperceptible, gradual, and administrative. Systems designed for stability resist change until adaptation becomes impossible. Warning signs accumulate unnoticed. Crisis develops silently. By the time the collapse is visible, it has been inevitable for decades. As the decades passed, the bureaucracy became an increasingly heavy machine. Officials were selected through examinations that emphasized classical knowledge and literary skill rather than practical problem solving. Reports were filed meticulously, but action was slow. Every decision required layers of approval. Every deviation from precedent risked censure. The system was excellent at maintaining order when conditions were stable, but it struggled when novelty or rapid adaptation was required. In the provinces, life continued in quiet routines. Farmers managed crops according to traditional calendars, unaware of the larger economic pressures accumulating from trade imbalances and population growth. Markets operated with a predictable rhythm, but the effects of opium consumption began to appear. A young worker might be late, distracted, or less productive, not because of laziness, but because of dependence on a substance introduced slowly and deliberately from foreign merchants. Trade networks across the coast were complex and carefully monitored. Customs inspectors recorded shipments, but corruption made enforcement inconsistent. Bribes, gifts, and informal agreements allowed opium to flow steadily. Silver left the country in exchange for opium, and gradually, local economies felt the drain. The immediate effect on households was often subtle: fewer savings, more debt, tension in family relationships. The long-term effect, however, was structural, weakening the empire from within. In the imperial court, discussions of policy were slow and methodical. Some officials advocated aggressive enforcement of the law. Others argued for compromise, fearing confrontation with foreign powers. Every decision was debated in extensive memoranda, analyzed through precedent, and weighed against the principles of Confucian governance. Even when decisive action was taken, it was often too limited to reverse systemic trends. The Opium War was the first clear signal that these internal weaknesses had strategic consequences. Yet the consequences went beyond the immediate military defeat. The treaties that followed institutionalized foreign privilege, creating permanent gaps in sovereignty. The empire remained nominally intact, but its ability to control ports, collect revenue, and manage international relations was substantially diminished. Governance became reactive. The state responded to events rather than shaping them. In the interior, social and economic pressures increased. Population growth continued steadily. But arable land and resources did not expand at the same rate. Taxes became heavier, and collection more burdensome. Urbanization strained traditional markets and infrastructure. Traditional craft industries declined, replaced gradually by imported goods and foreign-controlled production. Rebellions emerged as symptoms of these pressures. They were not immediate causes of collapse, but rather indicators that the system could no longer manage its people effectively. The Taiping Rebellion, for instance, was rooted in social, religious, and economic dissatisfaction. It claimed tens of millions of lives over decades. The Qing government survived, but the cost was immense, both in human life and administrative credibility. Meanwhile, foreign influence expanded quietly. Loans funded infrastructure, but projects often prioritized commercial benefit for foreigners over the integration of Chinese society. Railways, ports, and factories were constructed, but they were operated largely under foreign oversight. Modern technology arrived, but the administrative structures to support it lagged behind. Modern arsenals, steamships, and telegraph lines existed alongside ancient bureaucratic routines, creating inefficiency and friction. Ordinary citizens experienced the effects of this slow transformation in subtle ways. Families lost members to rebellion or disease. Merchants faced unpredictable regulations or foreign competition. Soldiers, poorly trained by modern standards, became unreliable in both internal suppression and defense against foreign incursions. Education slowly shifted as new schools taught foreign sciences and languages, yet the majority of officials still relied on classical examinations. By the late 19th century, the Qing dynasty retained authority in name, but its operational capacity was deeply compromised. Central governance struggled to coordinate responses across provinces. Decisions that should have been swift required extensive consultation and were often delayed. Authority fractured, with regional leaders assuming powers formerly held by the central state. The arrival of additional foreign powers compounded these challenges. France, Germany, Russia, and later Japan each exerted influence through treaties, concessions, and loans. Diplomatic pressure, often framed as legal or commercial agreements, undermined Chinese autonomy further. The state, already weakened by internal rigidity and corruption, could not counter these pressures effectively. The cumulative effect of decades of slow decline was profound. By the turn of the 20th century, society had adapted to dysfunction. Citizens were accustomed to foreign privilege, inconsistent enforcement, and regional disparities in governance. The empire appeared stable on the surface, but the underlying structures were hollow. Technological and industrial advancements had arrived, but they were misaligned with governance. Factories existed, railways connected cities, and telegraphs transmitted messages rapidly, but the administration lacked the capacity to use these tools effectively. Military modernization was incomplete. Equipment might be advanced, but command structures remained outdated. At the same time, social expectations began to shift. Exposure to foreign ideas, the growing visibility of global trade, and the inequities of imperial administration fueled discontent. Educational reforms introduced new subjects, but these often clashed with traditional norms, creating tension between innovation and continuity. By the early 20th century, the Qing dynasty still governed, but it was governing in a fundamentally new world. Its traditional structures, designed for centuries of internal stability, were incompatible with industrialized global power, rapid communication, and mass mobilization. When the Republican Revolution arrived in 1911, the fall of the dynasty was less dramatic than expected. It was a quiet administrative transition, the final confirmation of weaknesses that had accumulated over decades. Empires do not always collapse because of invasion or immediate catastrophe. They often decline because their structures, which once ensured survival, become constraints. Rigid systems resist necessary adaptation. Warning signs, small failures, and internal stresses accumulate slowly. By the time collapse is visible, the process has been decades in the making. As central authority weakened, provincial administration took on a life of its own. Local officials, once tightly controlled by imperial oversight, began to operate with increasing autonomy. In theory, they remained loyal to the throne. In practice, their priorities shifted toward maintaining local stability, personal security, and financial survival. Tax collection became uneven. Some regions over-collected to prepare for uncertainty. Others under-collected to avoid unrest. Revenue that once flowed predictably to the center now stalled. Diverted by corruption or absorbed by local needs. The imperial treasury struggled to plan beyond immediate crises. Corruption was not a sudden moral collapse. It was an adaptive behavior. Officials faced rising costs, declining authority, and growing expectations. Bribes became a means of managing risk. Informal payments ensured cooperation where formal power no longer sufficed. Daily governance turned into negotiation. A regulation might exist on paper, but its enforcement depended on relationships, favors, and circumstance. This flexibility preserved short-term order while undermining long-term coherence. In port cities, the presence of foreigners altered daily life. Foreign concessions operated under separate legal systems. Chinese law did not fully apply. Merchants adapted, learning which courts mattered and which rules could be bypassed. Economic opportunity expanded, but so did inequality. Trade networks grew more complex. Traditional merchants competed with foreign firms that had access to capital, shipping, and legal protection. Local businesses survived by specialization or collaboration. Some prospered, many did not. Inland, the effects were slower but persistent. Imported goods displaced traditional crafts. Artisans lost livelihoods. Rural migration increased, adding pressure to cities already struggling with sanitation, housing, and employment. Opium remained part of this environment. Addiction did not dominate every life, but it remained widespread enough to weaken productivity and family stability. The state continued to issue bans and proclamations, but enforcement lacked consistency. The problem had become normalized. Military reform was attempted repeatedly. New units were trained. Weapons were imported. Uniforms were redesigned. But command structures remained fragmented. Loyalty was often regional rather than national. Funding was inconsistent. When conflicts arose, responses varied. Some units performed adequately. Others collapsed quickly. The absence of unified command limited effectiveness. Education reforms introduced Western subjects, science, mathematics, foreign languages. New schools operated alongside traditional academies. Students navigated conflicting expectations. Classical knowledge still determined official advancement, while practical skills increasingly shaped economic opportunity. This dual system created generational tension. Older officials distrusted unfamiliar methods. Younger scholars questioned the relevance of tradition. Consensus was rare. Foreign advisors were invited to assist modernization. They offered expertise, but also influence. Their recommendations often prioritized efficiency over sovereignty. The state accepted advice selectively, balancing fear of dependence with fear of stagnation. International pressure intensified. Japan's rapid modernization provided an unsettling comparison. Defeat in the Sino-Japanese War further exposed systemic weakness. Reform debates grew urgent, but unity remained elusive. At the level of ordinary life, uncertainty became routine. Families adjusted expectations downward. Security replaced ambition. Survival mattered more than progress. When reforms were announced, they were often incomplete. Implementation varied by region. Resistance slowed change. Momentum dissipated. By the early 20th century, the Qing dynasty governed an empire accustomed to improvisation. Stability existed, but it was fragile. Authority functioned through habit rather than confidence. The revolution of 1911 did not erupt from a single cause. It emerged from accumulated fatigue. The system no longer commanded loyalty strong enough to defend itself. When power shifted, it did so with limited resistance. The dynasty ended quietly. Edicts were issued. Titles were relinquished. An era closed without spectacle. What followed was not immediate renewal. The new republic inherited the same structural problems: regionalism, weak central authority, economic imbalance, and social uncertainty. Change in name did not guarantee change in function. The legacy of the Qing decline persisted. Institutions weakened by decades of delay could not be rebuilt quickly. Modernization remained uneven. Stability remained elusive. This is the enduring lesson of slow history. Decline rarely announces itself. It accumulates through small compromises, delayed reforms, and systems optimized for the past. Empires fall not only when defeated, but when they outlive their ability to adapt. The early years of the Republic did not feel like a new beginning. They felt like an extension of uncertainty. The imperial system had disappeared, but the habits, structures, and limitations it left behind remained. Central authority was weak from the start. The new government inherited ministries without discipline, provinces without loyalty, and an army without unified command. Power was fragmented. Decisions required negotiation with regional leaders who controlled troops, revenue, and territory. These leaders were later described as warlords. But at the time they were simply local power holders filling a vacuum. They did not emerge suddenly. They had been accumulating authority for decades as the Qing state weakened. Each region adapted independently. Some focused on stability. Others prioritized extraction. Few coordinated with the center. Taxation became inconsistent. Trade routes were disrupted by competing authorities. Infrastructure suffered from neglect or misuse. The population adjusted to instability as a normal condition. Foreign powers continued to exert influence. Loans were offered with conditions. Advisors shaped policy indirectly. Ports and railways remained tied to external interests. The promise of modernization persisted, but implementation was uneven. Factories operated without integrated supply chains. Education expanded without a unified curriculum. Military reform advanced without centralized oversight. Ordinary people experienced history as repetition. Another authority replaced the previous one. Rules changed slightly. Obligations remained. Trust in institutions eroded further. Loyalty became personal rather than national. Survival depended on adaptability. The legacy of the Qing decline shaped this environment deeply. Delayed reform had weakened administrative capacity. Partial modernization had created imbalance. Foreign intervention had normalized dependence. The past did not disappear. It continued to influence decisions, expectations, and limitations. History often frames the fall of empires as endings. In reality, they are transitions burdened by inheritance. The Qing dynasty's greatest impact was not its collapse, but the conditions it left behind. This is how boring history works. Not through dramatic moments, but through accumulated constraints. Systems fail slowly. And the future is shaped long before anyone realizes the past has ended. As the Republican government struggled to establish legitimacy, daily governance remained improvised. Policies were announced, revised, and often ignored. Implementation depended on local conditions rather than central intent. This was not chaos in the dramatic sense. It was administrative fatigue. Officials who had once served the empire continued in office under new titles. Their habits did not change quickly. Paperwork still moved slowly. Decisions were delayed. Authority was negotiated rather than enforced. The absence of a strong center meant that long-term planning was nearly impossible. Budgets addressed immediate needs. Infrastructure projects stalled. Maintenance was neglected. What existed continued to function, but rarely improved. Economic life adjusted to uncertainty. Merchants diversified risk. Trade routes shifted to avoid instability. Local currencies circulated alongside national ones. Confidence was fragmented, mirroring governance. Foreign involvement remained a constant presence. Treaties signed decades earlier continued to shape trade and law. Customs revenue remained partially controlled by external administrators. Economic sovereignty was limited, even as political forms changed. Education reform progressed unevenly. New schools produced graduates with modern skills but limited opportunities. Traditional examinations were abolished, removing a familiar path to status without fully replacing it. This created frustration among educated youth, many of whom questioned the legitimacy of existing institutions. Military forces reflected the same imbalance. Some units were well equipped and disciplined. Others were poorly supplied and loosely controlled. Loyalty followed pay and proximity rather than ideology. Conflicts between regional authorities became frequent. They were not always large-scale wars. Often they were negotiations backed by force. Territory changed hands quietly. The population adapted. In rural areas, life remained harsh but familiar. Peasants focused on survival. Political change felt distant. Taxes were paid to whoever demanded them. Stability was measured locally, not nationally. The memory of imperial order lingered, not as nostalgia, but as comparison. The past was remembered as predictable, even if flawed. The present felt uncertain. This perception mattered. Legitimacy depends not only on ideology, but on reliability. The new system struggled to provide either. The long decline of the Qing had left behind weakened institutions and normalized compromise. Reform without authority became adjustment. Authority without reform became coercion. Neither produced stability. History often asks when decline ends and renewal begins. In reality, they overlap. One fades while the other struggles to form. The transition from empire to republic did not resolve the structural problems accumulated over centuries. It inherited them. This is the quiet continuity of boring history. Change appears dramatic on paper. In practice, it is incremental, uneven, and constrained by what came before. The story does not end with collapse. It continues through adaptation. And adaptation, when delayed too long, is rarely elegant. As regional authorities consolidated their control, governance became increasingly localized. The idea of a unified national direction existed mostly in speeches and documents. On the ground, power was practical rather than ideological. Those who could maintain order, collect revenue, and control armed forces governed, regardless of official titles. This arrangement produced a form of stability that was narrow and fragile. Roads were kept open where trade mattered. Markets functioned where protection was reliable. Outside these zones, uncertainty prevailed. For ordinary people, politics became background noise. What mattered was whether crops could be harvested, whether markets were safe, whether taxes would suddenly increase. Loyalty followed predictability. Memory played an important role. The imperial era was remembered not as just or prosperous, but as structured. Rules had been clear. Authority had been distant but consistent. The present lacked that consistency. This perception shaped expectations. People no longer demanded progress. They demanded order. Intellectual debates continued among elites. Some argued that only radical modernization could resolve instability. Others believed that restoring centralized authority was the priority. Few agreed on how either goal could be achieved. Foreign observers analyzed the situation through their own interests. Instability was seen as opportunity. Loans were extended. Influence was negotiated. Control was exercised without direct rule. Economic patterns reflected this environment. Investment favored short-term returns. Long-term development was risky. Infrastructure existed to move goods outward, not to integrate regions inward. Social trust eroded slowly. Institutions were viewed as temporary. Promises were discounted. Contracts required personal enforcement. Education continued to produce individuals aware of global ideas but constrained by local realities. This gap between knowledge and opportunity created frustration. Some turned toward activism. Others toward resignation. The long decline that began under the Qing shaped these responses. Delayed reform had normalized compromise. Partial modernization had created imbalance. Foreign pressure had limited autonomy. The result was a society skilled at adaptation but wary of uncertainty. History often portrays this period as chaotic. In practice, it was repetitive. The same problems reappeared in different forms. The same solutions were attempted with minor variation. This repetition is the hallmark of slow decline. Not collapse, but stagnation. Change remained possible, but it required authority strong enough to implement reform and flexible enough to adapt. Such authority had not yet emerged. And so the story continued. Not toward resolution, but toward another phase shaped by the same accumulated constraints. As time passed, exhaustion became a defining feature of public life. Not dramatic exhaustion, but administrative and social fatigue. People adapted to instability by lowering expectations. Ambition narrowed. Risk avoidance became a rational choice. Local authorities focused on immediate control rather than long-term planning. Revenue was used to secure loyalty and maintain order. Investment in future capacity was rare. Short horizons dominated decision-making. This environment discouraged coordination. Regional leaders had little incentive to cooperate beyond necessity. Trust between jurisdictions was limited. National policy existed mostly in theory. Foreign economic presence adjusted accordingly. Businesses navigated fragmented authority with experience. Negotiation replaced regulation. Influence followed predictability rather than legitimacy. Cultural life reflected this adaptation. Art, literature, and commentary became cautious. Direct criticism carried risk. Indirect expression became common. The population became skilled at reading signals rather than rules. Informal knowledge mattered more than formal law. Survival depended on awareness, not certainty. The legacy of imperial administration persisted quietly. Procedures survived even as authority changed. Forms were familiar. Outcomes were not. This continuity masked decline. Life continued. Markets opened. Schools taught. Trains ran. Yet coordination weakened. Capacity eroded. Confidence declined. History, viewed from a distance, often compresses such periods into labels. From within, they feel long and repetitive. Days resemble one another. Change appears distant. The system had not collapsed. It had thinned. This thinning made later transformation both possible and costly. Old structures no longer resisted forcefully. But they also provided little support. What followed would be shaped not only by new ideas, but by the long habits of adaptation formed during decline. Boring history does not rush. It accumulates. And accumulation, once complete, defines what comes next. As the system continued to thin, authority became quieter rather than weaker. Orders were issued, but enforcement relied on interpretation. Compliance depended on relationships. Power functioned through familiarity instead of command. People learned which rules mattered and which could be ignored. This knowledge was not written. It was shared through observation. Mistakes were costly. Experience became the only reliable guide. The concept of national direction faded into abstraction. New slogans appeared. They circulated through newspapers and speeches. Their meaning changed depending on location. Consistency was optional. Bureaucratic routines persisted. Documents were filed. Reports were submitted. Statistics were collected with uneven accuracy. The appearance of governance remained intact. This appearance reassured foreign observers. Stability was measured by surface continuity. Underlying fragility was overlooked. Predictability mattered more than capacity. Economic life followed this logic. Production continued at reduced ambition. Distribution adjusted to risk. Innovation slowed, not from lack of ideas, but from lack of protection. Capital avoided permanence. Labor avoided commitment. Everything remained provisional. Education expanded quietly. Literacy increased. Awareness widened. Expectation remained restrained. This produced a population that understood global narratives but lived local realities. Knowledge without leverage created tension. Patience wore thin. The imperial past still shaped perception. Not as an ideal, but as a benchmark. People compared uncertainty to remembered structure. Structure felt safer. This comparison influenced behavior. Order became more valued than participation. Authority more desired than debate. The decline had trained society to prioritize endurance over aspiration. This training mattered. History often emphasizes moments of revolution. Less attention is given to the years that prepare a population to accept them. Acceptance does not require enthusiasm, only fatigue. As fragmentation continued, coordination became episodic. Temporary alliances formed. They dissolved when conditions changed. Trust never matured. Military power followed similar patterns. Control existed locally. National integration remained incomplete. Force maintained boundaries, not unity. Foreign pressure adjusted rather than retreated. Influence adapted to fragmentation. Negotiation replaced confrontation. Dependency remained subtle. The system survived by flexibility. But flexibility without direction leads to drift. Drift is difficult to detect. It feels like continuity. Life proceeds. Institutions operate. Change is gradual. Yet capacity erodes quietly. Coordination weakens slowly. Confidence dissolves over time. This erosion shaped expectations. People learned not to expect resolution, only adjustment. Adjustment became cultural habit. When future authority emerged, it would inherit this habit. It would govern a population trained by decline. The story continues not toward clarity, but toward accumulation. Each year added another layer of adaptation. Each layer reduced resistance and resilience simultaneously. Boring history does not announce its consequences. It prepares them. And preparation, once complete, determines what is possible. As years accumulated, the rhythm of life settled into predictability without progress. Seasons repeated. Administrations changed names. Outcomes remained familiar. People no longer waited for reform. They waited for signals. A change in leadership mattered less than a change in enforcement. Rules were meaningful only when consistently applied. This environment rewarded caution. Those who survived longest were those who avoided extremes. Moderation became strategy. Silence became safety. Public discourse narrowed. Grand visions were discussed privately. Public language focused on stability, order, and continuity. Disruption was framed as danger rather than possibility. Institutions learned to protect themselves rather than serve objectives. Survival replaced purpose. Departments guarded jurisdiction. Coordination required negotiation at every step. This self-preservation slowed decline but deepened stagnation. Problems were managed, not solved. Crises were postponed, not resolved. Economic activity mirrored this logic. Businesses favored replication over innovation. Expansion was cautious. Risk was externalized whenever possible. Infrastructure aged. Maintenance extended lifespan without improvement. Systems functioned just well enough to avoid collapse. Education continued to produce awareness. But awareness without mobility led to disengagement. Talent dispersed quietly. Ambition redirected inward or outward. Social trust weakened further. Commitments were provisional. Long-term cooperation became rare. Short-term alignment dominated. The memory of imperial governance faded into abstraction. What remained was not loyalty, but expectation. Authority was expected to be distant, firm, and predictable. Participation was not expected. This expectation shaped political outcomes. Movements that promised clarity gained attention. Complex solutions struggled to mobilize support. The long decline had simplified demand. People wanted fewer things, but they wanted them consistently. Boring history rarely features villains. It features incentives. Incentives shaped behavior quietly. They rewarded stability over creativity, control over collaboration, endurance over reform. Over time, the system's flexibility diminished. Adaptation became routine rather than responsive. Signals were misread. Opportunities passed unnoticed. This was not collapse. It was inertia. Inertia accumulates. It does not announce itself. It becomes visible only when force is applied. The society that emerged from this period was not passive. It was conditioned. Conditioned by repetition. Conditioned by constraint. When change finally arrived, it would encounter a population accustomed to adjustment, not participation. That habit would shape everything that followed. History often credits decisive moments with shaping outcomes. But decisive moments succeed only when long preparation allows them to. Preparation can be intentional, or it can be the byproduct of boredom. This was the latter. As inertia deepened, decision-making slowed further. Not because decisions were difficult, but because consequences were unclear. Action carried risk. Inaction carried familiarity. Officials preferred delay to error. Delay could be explained. Error could not. This logic filtered downward. Teachers followed outdated curricula. Engineers reused proven methods. Administrators copied previous reports. Originality was unnecessary. The system became archival rather than directional. It recorded activity more than it shaped outcomes. Documents accumulated. Meaning diluted. Public life adjusted accordingly. Expectations were calibrated low. Success meant avoidance of disruption. Failure meant visible change. Foreign relationships reflected this stasis. External actors learned patience. Influence was applied gradually. Pressure was subtle. Nothing needed to be forced. Time did the work. Markets operated within narrow margins. Price stability mattered more than growth. Supply chains adapted to fragmentation. Efficiency was sacrificed for resilience. This resilience was misleading. It preserved function, not capacity. It prevented collapse, not decline. Social mobility slowed. Paths existed, but they were narrow. Advancement required alignment rather than merit. Talent learned to wait. Waiting became a skill. So did endurance. The culture of waiting reshaped ambition. Long-term plans were abstract. Short-term security dominated choices. Life was organized around continuity. This continuity felt safe. But it limited imagination. History often treats imagination as a luxury. In reality, it is a prerequisite for renewal. Without it, reform appears threatening. The long decline had trained society to fear uncertainty more than stagnation. This fear was rational. Uncertainty had consequences. Stagnation was survivable. Political language adjusted. Stability became synonymous with legitimacy. Order replaced vision. Control replaced coordination. The past no longer felt distant. It felt instructive. Structure was remembered as safety. Flexibility as danger. These memories were selective. But they were powerful. They shaped acceptance. Acceptance shaped outcomes. Boring history rarely creates momentum. It creates conditions. Conditions accumulate quietly. They shape responses before choices appear. By the time change became unavoidable, preference had already been formed. Clarity was valued over complexity. Direction over debate. The society that emerged from this period was not unaware. It was tired. Tired of adjustment. Tired of negotiation. Tired of uncertainty. Fatigue is not ideology. But it supports one. This is how long decline prepares the ground. Not through persuasion. Through repetition. As fatigue settled deeper, the meaning of participation changed. Engagement no longer implied influence. It implied compliance. Attendance mattered more than input. Presence replaced agency. Organizations learned to perform stability. Meetings were held. Resolutions were recorded. Outcomes were predictable. Process mattered more than result. This performance reassured observers. From a distance, continuity suggested control. From within, it felt hollow. People adjusted language carefully. Words became indirect. Certainty was avoided. Ambiguity was safer. The gap between formal structure and lived reality widened. Rules existed, but enforcement varied. Rights were declared, but access depended on context. Equality was procedural, not practical. Economic behavior adapted further. Savings were prioritized over investment. Assets favored portability. Security mattered more than scale. Labor patterns reflected caution. Skill development slowed. Specialization carried risk. Versatility was survival. Education continued to expand knowledge without expanding opportunity. Credentials multiplied. Positions did not. Competition intensified quietly. This produced restraint rather than rebellion. People learned to manage disappointment. Expectation was moderated. Resilience was internalized. The long decline normalized this psychology. Adaptation became identity. Flexibility replaced conviction. History often treats this period as prelude. In lived experience, it felt endless. Years blended together. Markers of progress were rare. Administrative memory dominated planning. What had worked before was repeated. What had failed was avoided. Innovation required justification. Foreign influence remained calibrated. Pressure increased only when resistance was minimal. Timing mattered more than force. Nothing needed to be rushed. The system was already prepared. Cultural narratives shifted subtly. Stability was framed as virtue. Disruption as irresponsibility. Order as moral good. These narratives were not imposed abruptly. They evolved naturally from experience. Experience had taught caution. The legacy of decline was not confusion. It was clarity of preference. Predictability over possibility. Control over experimentation. This clarity limited alternatives. When choices narrowed, outcomes became easier to manage. Boring history does not erase agency. It reshapes it. It channels decision-making toward the familiar. By the time decisive change appeared, familiarity had already won. The population did not demand transformation. It accepted direction. This acceptance was not passive. It was learned. Learned through repetition. Learned through survival. Learned through time. As acceptance became habitual, resistance lost its language. Not because disagreement disappeared, but because it found no outlet. Energy redirected inward. Critique softened into observation. Institutions absorbed this quiet. Silence was interpreted as consent. Compliance was mistaken for stability. Feedback loops weakened. Time continued its work. Generations who had not known coordinated authority grew accustomed to fragmented norms. What once felt temporary became normal. Normality shaped expectation. Administrative systems refined routine. They became efficient at repetition. Change required exceptional justification. Continuity required none. This imbalance favored caution. Innovation carried burden of proof. Tradition carried none. Economic actors adapted again. Scale was avoided. Flexibility prioritized. Long commitments were rare. Networks replaced hierarchies. Personal trust mattered more than formal assurance. Relationships substituted for institutions. This substitution sustained function, but it weakened structure. Systems survived through improvisation. Improvisation exhausted capacity. Civic identity narrowed. Belonging became local. National abstraction lost relevance. Participation was symbolic. Education emphasized competence without empowerment. Knowledge, agency did not. This mismatch deepened resignation. Cultural output reflected restraint. Narratives avoided confrontation. Subtlety replaced assertion. Ambiguity became art. Foreign observers read calm as consolidation. They underestimated fatigue. They mistook endurance for strength. Policy responses followed misreadings. Engagement assumed stability. Leverage increased gradually. Dependency deepened quietly. None of this felt dramatic. Days passed normally. Work continued. Life adjusted. This is the deceptive nature of boring history. It unfolds without spectacle. It reshapes incentives invisibly. It conditions response. Over time, the cost of disruption rose. Even beneficial change threatened routines. Risk tolerance declined further. Collective imagination narrowed. Alternatives seemed impractical. Familiar constraints felt safer than unknown options. The system did not collapse under pressure. It accommodated it. Accommodation preserved surface order. But it consumed depth. Depth matters. Without it, systems respond slowly. They absorb shock poorly. They rely on force rather than coordination. This reliance was learned, not chosen. Learned through repetition. When decisive authority finally emerged, it encountered little friction. Not because it was universally supported, but because opposition had been trained into caution. The groundwork had been laid long before. By boredom, by fatigue, by adaptation. History later attributes outcomes to moments. But moments succeed only when preparation allows them to. This preparation was quiet. It took decades. It required no speeches. It required time. As time continued, the line between governance and administration blurred. Authority existed more in paperwork than in action. Decisions were recorded, debated, and approved, but often implemented only partially, if at all. Processes mattered more than results. Local administrators became the real arbiters of daily life. They decided what could be done, what needed to wait, and what would be ignored. Their judgments were pragmatic rather than ideological. This created pockets of consistency and zones of improvisation. People adapted. They learned the boundaries of safety and risk. They negotiated survival through subtle observation. Flexibility became instinct. Routine became reassurance. Trade followed similar patterns. Markets operated within known limits. Merchants adjusted to irregular enforcement. Foreign trade persisted, but under conditions defined by negotiation rather than law. Profit required understanding local expectations more than national policy. Education expanded in theory, but opportunity remained constrained. Schools produced knowledge that could not always be applied. Graduates learned global concepts while navigating local realities. Aspiration was tempered by practicality. Military authority reflected this same principle. Units existed nominally under central command. In practice, loyalty was regional, based on pay, leadership, and opportunity. Coordination between units was episodic. National campaigns relied on negotiation rather than hierarchy. Society internalized this system. Compliance became habitual. Participation was measured in small, observable acts rather than broad influence. Critique became private, indirect, or symbolic. Endurance replaced activism. Cultural life mirrored these adaptations. Art avoided controversy. Literature emphasized subtlety. Expression became coded rather than explicit. Ambiguity was survival. Foreign influence leveraged these patterns. Patience replaced pressure. Incremental advantage replaced direct control. External power operated through subtle integration, not confrontation. Economic systems reinforced this logic. Short-term planning predominated. Investment avoided exposure. Labor became versatile, not specialized. Businesses operated under local negotiation rather than systemic rules. The population became conditioned to slow change. Decisions were filtered through layers of habit. Expectations adjusted downward. Risk became personal rather than systemic. History often celebrates moments of collapse or revolution. In reality, preparation for such moments occurs over decades of ordinary behavior. Routine, repetition, and adaptation are the architects of eventual outcomes. Authority, once centralized, now relied on habits formed by years of fatigue and compromise. When decisive change arrived, society was neither unprepared nor resistant. It was conditioned to accept, adapt, and endure. Boring history does not make dramatic headlines. It works quietly. It shapes incentives. It constrains imagination. It conditions populations. It prepares the ground. The long decline of old institutions was not visible in a single day. It unfolded across generations, leaving lessons learned, behaviors repeated, and expectations normalized. By the time reform or revolution appeared inevitable, the population's psychology had been trained by repetition. They expected continuity, even in the face of structural change. They valued order over ambition, predictability over novelty, and endurance over innovation. This is the enduring power of slow, boring history. It accumulates, it shapes, it prepares, and it waits. Over decades, the rhythm of life continued without dramatic interruption. Markets opened and closed on schedule. Taxes were collected according to precedent. Reports were filed with meticulous attention to detail. Yet the meaning behind each act shifted subtly. Compliance became procedural. People followed routines because they were known, not because they were commanded. Authority existed less as power and more as expectation. Deviation carried risk, but conformity carried safety. Administrators learned to navigate ambiguity. Rules were applied selectively. They adapted to circumstances. Consistency mattered only where visibility demanded it. Otherwise, improvisation governed daily reality. Trade networks grew complex but predictable. Local merchants understood what could be traded, when, and under whose oversight. Foreign merchants followed similar patterns, negotiating through intermediaries and personal connections. Contracts were interpreted flexibly. Survival required negotiation more than compliance. The military mirrored this approach. Units existed in name under central command. In practice, loyalty was local. Orders were interpreted. Coordination occurred only when the cost of non-compliance exceeded tolerance. Ordinary citizens adjusted expectations accordingly. They learned the boundaries of safety. They optimized behavior for continuity. Risk was personal, not structural. Endurance became habitual. Education expanded in reach but remained uneven in effect. Knowledge grew faster than opportunity. Schools taught modern sciences and languages, but social mobility remained constrained. Ambition was moderated. Compliance and adaptability were rewarded more than creativity. Cultural life reflected the same patterns. Art became cautious. Literature emphasized subtlety and illusion. Expression avoided confrontation. Ambiguity was not artistic choice, it was survival. Foreign powers operated with patience. Influence was incremental. Pressure was applied subtly through treaties, loans, and concessions. Local adaptation ensured that power functioned without disruption. Economically, people prioritized survival. Savings were valued more than investment. Labor became versatile, not specialized. Businesses relied on flexibility over scale. Markets adapted through local negotiation rather than systemic rules. The population's psychology shifted gradually. Decisions became filtered through habit. Expectations adjusted downward. Survival took precedence over advancement. History, when observed retrospectively, often identifies moments of collapse or revolution. Yet the groundwork for these events is laid over decades of repetition, adjustment, and endurance. It is not dramatic, it is accumulative. Authority, once centralized, now depended on ingrained habit. Decisive change did not face unprepared populations. It faced populations trained to adjust. Boring history rarely produces immediate spectacle. It reshapes incentives. It constrains imagination. It molds expectations. It prepares the ground for what is possible. The decline of old institutions is invisible in a single day. It unfolds across years and decades, leaving silent lessons and behavioral adaptations. By the time new authority emerges, society has been conditioned to prefer order over ambition, predictability over novelty, and endurance over innovation. This is the power of slow history. It accumulates quietly. It prepares thoroughly. And it waits patiently for the right moment. Provincial life became the anchor of continuity. Cities and towns operated on habitual rhythms. Markets opened with the sun. Farms followed seasonal cycles. Local officials enforced rules selectively. Daily life adjusted to what could be relied upon, not to what was promised. Families adapted to uncertainty. Children learned routines that minimized exposure to risk. Labor patterns were flexible, shifting according to need. Opportunities were seized only when predictable. Ambition was calibrated to circumstance. Local governance reflected centuries of adaptation. Officials had authority in theory and discretion in practice. They interpreted central decrees, negotiated with merchants, and balanced local interests. Compliance from the population was earned through consistency, not coercion. Trade networks operated within these bounds. Merchants learned to read social and administrative signals. Contracts were contingent, based on relationships and precedent. Foreign traders adapted as well, leveraging informal channels to maintain commerce. Profit came from negotiation, not rigid regulation. Education expanded in parallel. Schools taught modern languages, mathematics, and science. Yet employment remained tied to local influence and patronage. Knowledge grew faster than opportunity. Frustration and patience coexisted quietly. Military organization mirrored provincial adaptation. Troops existed on paper. In practice, loyalty was local. Command was negotiated. Coordination occurred episodically and with considerable effort. Central authority had limited reach. But local enforcement ensured survival. Social norms emphasized endurance. Deviation was risky. Observation replaced innovation. Community functioned through shared understanding of limits. Habit dictated behavior more than ideology. Cultural expression was constrained yet resilient. Art, literature, and philosophy found subtle ways to comment on reality. Ambiguity became a form of safety. Indirect communication was not preference, it was survival. Foreign influence operated in tandem with these adaptations. Loans, concessions, and treaties were mediated locally. Incremental control replaced overt intervention. Dependency emerged quietly. Economics reinforced this logic. Short-term stability trumped long-term growth. Labor became mobile and flexible. Markets relied on adaptability. Risk was minimized. Survival was optimized. The population's psychology was shaped by repetition. Decision-making became filtered through habit. Expectations adjusted downward. Endurance became a default response. History often attributes change to singular events. In practice, decades of incremental adaptation determined outcomes. Revolutions succeed when population habits align with the new order. Authority, once strong and centralized, now depended on ingrained behaviors. When reforms or revolutions arrived, The population was conditioned to accept, adjust, and endure. Boring history is cumulative. It shapes institutions, behaviors, and expectations invisibly. It prepares society for transitions without spectacle. It works through repetition, endurance, and subtle adaptation. The decline of old institutions unfolds slowly. It leaves behind conditioned habits rather than visible ruins. By the time change appears, it meets a population shaped to maintain continuity. Society values consistency over novelty, predictability over innovation, and survival over risk. This is the enduring impact of slow, boring history. It accumulates quietly, invisibly, and inexorably.